Welcome back everyone. This is another happy day. Whenever we get to talk about Nintendo or Sony or any other consoles in general, it is just going to be a great week. Now first of all, I've already covered the DS, the original DS, the DS Lite, the DSi and XL, and now we're getting to the kind of juicy stuff, the Nintendo 3DS. Now for sure when it comes down to it, I personally don't think the 3DS was as influential of a console genre as the Switch is or how the DS Lite was, or even the DSi. I genuinely do think the DSi is such an underrated console in so many different ways, but for sure the 3DS is a solid successor to the DSi lineup, and I do think it still deserves a lot of credit. It kind of sits in that like Wii U kind of phase where like a lot of people use it. It's I think the last generation of that dual screen, device that ever came out, but I do think at the end of the day it's a console worth talking about. They've iterated it a couple times, and I think it's a great console at the end of the day. There's really nothing super crazy about it, but I do think it had the most gimmicky feature out of all of them, which was that 3D toggle. I feel like Nintendo was just out of pocket. I don't know what they were trying to do, but they try to do something that I will never understand. It's just a very strange thing. And whenever I personally use that 3D toggle, it actually kind of caused some, strain in my head for a little bit, just like how everyone else was. Now, I don't know if there were a bunch of lawsuits or whatever, but every time I talk about this console and I look in the comment section, there are some people who are like, yeah, anytime I use that 3D toggle, or I had some DMs on Instagram or something, people were like, anytime I use those 3D toggles, it made me a little lightheaded. It just didn't really feel right. So most people always used it with the 3D toggle off. Now the 3DS originally came out or was announced in 2010. It wasn't publicly available as far as I know until 2011 or early 2011. And the biggest development, as far as I can tell, and one of the biggest changes was pretty much not only the 3D toggle, but the bigger display up top. So it had that larger display and the smaller display on the bottom. And I do like the separation. I feel like eventually it would have been better had it just been like all screen up top. I feel like out of all the DS consoles, the 2DS is probably the one that did it the best because it had, similar screens for the top and bottom and a less bezel. But this 3DS still looks pretty good. Now, closed when this thing is on, closed for the most part. For some reason, Nintendo was always killing it in terms of future-proofing the cameras. I don't know what it is with them, but in the DSi back in the day, they had a back camera and a front camera. And with the 3DS, we actually had a dual camera setup on the back of this thing, which was supposed to allow you to take like 3D type of photos or 3D type of videos or something. Again, kind of like another gimmicky kind of thing, but it's so funny because nowadays, if we don't have a dual camera setup on our device, it's outdated. So the 3DS's camera, if you think about it, is still pretty current, even though I think they're like standard lenses or whatever. It's still pretty interesting that they had that capability. Now you did have kind of a new shinier texture up top, which was cool. It kind of reminds me more so of like the DSi XL that had that Super Mario version. For some reason that reminded me the most of the 3DS lineup, but still totally okay, and it still looks really, really good for the most part. Now when you go ahead and open this thing up, that's when you see the two screens. So again, you had that bigger screen up top, and then you had that smaller screen on the bottom. Now, the biggest change also that came with these specific 3DSs was the new joystick. So not only did you have the standard D-pad and the arrow keys and stuff, but you actually had the joystick above that. And that was one of the things that whenever I looked at the PlayStation Ps, one thing that I really kind of wish that our consoles had. And now we actually did eventually have that for our 3DS, which was really cool. So a lot of games that came out did incorporate that joystick, which was really awesome. Eventually with our Joy-Cons for our Switches, that kind of is a little bit of a touchy subject because still like it's not really working out that well, and a lot of our Joy-Cons are experiencing issues, but I still think it's totally okay for the most part, and I really did like that new design language. Now you did have the select, home, and start button, the physical buttons at the bottom, which I wasn't too big of a fan of, but I was a fan of that power button. The fact that we had a physical button there rather than it being like a little slide up thing on the side, or however the DSi had it, which I totally forgot. This thing actually was a physical button that you clicked in, which I actually did like. Now, funny enough, when you actually look at the bottom of this thing, you actually see a centered charging port, which is kind of strange. Whenever I think of a center charging port, I always think of something like our iPhones or something. With our consoles, it always seemed like it was on the side or, somewhere else, or the top even. I don't know why, it just kind of threw me off sometimes. But on the back, you had, obviously the expandable storage with the SD card and all that stuff. But for the most part, when I look around this console, it is still a solid feeling console. It doesn't feel cheap at all. It still looks great. It still performs great. And I do think for a majority of things you're going to do with it, when you're looking at it, it still looks like a very good console. console. Now, powering this thing up, this is the more interesting thing about it. I feel like this console has more, to do in my personal opinion, and more similarities with something like a Nintendo Wii than even like a Nintendo Wii U or even like the Nintendo Switch. Whenever I go through the software on this thing, whenever I do anything with it, it reminds me so much of my Nintendo Wii. And I think that's for the better. I think the software was one of the best things about these 3DSs, starting even with the DSi. And I really do think the DSi completely revolutionized the rest of the Nintendo console. Now, with the 3DS, the biggest competitor at that time was the PlayStation Vita. And I think at that point, Nintendo had to do something different. They couldn't just do the standard stuff that they normally would, because the PSP versus Vita lineup, that was like a really good, competition that they had. But with the 3DS versus PS Vita, I really don't think either one of these consoles won. I feel like the PS Vita, Sony just didn't do a really great job at marketing it and making, a ton of games available for that thing. But then I think with the 3DS, Nintendo was just so focused on these gimmicks where they had to just keep talking about this 3D toggle over and over and over again, that it overshadowed a lot of, the great games that came out with this thing and the great graphics that these games also came out with. When you think about it, a lot of those games that came out for the Wii U, and when you looked at the 3DS versions of them, they were pretty close in some ways, and I think that was a really big advantage the 3DS had. But again, the marketing behind it, especially at this time with Nintendo, with the Wii U and the 3DS, it wasn't that great, just like how the PlayStation Vita, but Sony was killing it for the PS4 at the time, so I think it was okay. Now, the gaming library of this thing was crazy. You had so many different games available for this thing, but also it had backwards compatibility. So you can go ahead and play your standard DS Lite games or DSi or whatever games that you had available for this thing, and that was another really awesome thing that you had going for it. You had the Nintendo eShop, which I think apparently just got discontinued very soon or whatever that was, which was kind of funny. And I made a video on my second channel, I think, talking about that, which I think is great. You had that internet browser, which was awesome. You had Mii Maker, which was another cool. You had obviously a lot of different things. And as I mentioned before, having that capability of playing all those games that were basically available for this thing is crazy, which is so awesome. Now, I don't want to say this console was a, failure. I don't think any, console in general is a failure unless it like blows up or something like that. I think the 3DS was not necessarily ahead of its time, but it was a great console at its core that maybe just wasn't marketed correctly. And I feel like the main gimmick of it, which was the 3D toggle, which was the 3D name in it, it just was a little bit different. And I don't really think people really appreciated it at that time. And I really don't think people liked it really beyond, what it was supposed to be, which was a gaming console. It's supposed to be a really, really good gaming console that has a solid gaming library. And unfortunately, as I stated before, Nintendo kind of focused too much on that 3D toggle portion, that every game, every commercial, every single thing that came out for it just had to be related to that 3D toggle. And, eventually with their Switch and all these other consoles they took out. But I think the 3DS, how it stands up now in 2021, it's a solid console for the price. It has an amazing gaming library, and I think it's great. I think it's an awesome game. I think it's an awesome video game console to have, especially now in 2021. It doesn't cost that much money. You can pick them up for fairly cheap nowadays compared to what they were, when they first came out. And the games nowadays are super cheap for this thing too. And honestly, if you want to modify it, it's worth it even more. I did modify my Nintendo 3DS XL. I had a great time doing it. It didn't really, take too much time. It's much easier than modding a Nintendo Switch. And I may have a video on my channel talking about it. Maybe I deleted it by now, but either or, I think the 3DS is an amazing console, and I think it's still worth it in 2021 for sure. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.